Good morning. We're here in the suburbs of Suffolk Park at my sister's little apiary here. And what we're going to do today is have a look at this hive and see what's going on. So this is my sister Mira, and she started off with one hive here in this location, and now you've taken a split to make a second hive. So what's going on with this hive now?
So actually about 3 weeks ago, actually on Christmas Day, I decided to come and check my bees because I hadn't checked them for a while. And I noticed that I had 7 frames of brood and just 1 frame of honey, like bumper to bumper. Really a lot of bees, and I'd been wanting to make a split for a while, so I decided to make a walk-away split. So basically I went through the hive and I picked 4 frames that had eggs and young larvae and brood, and made sure that actually the queen was in this hive. So I did actually find her, made sure I kept my queen in my original hive, and put 4 frames of brood in here and added in the extra missing frames. And I was going to hopefully let them make their own queen.
So on the frames you put in here, did you make sure there was eggs on those frames?
Yeah. So I made sure there was eggs, so they had available resources to make a new queen themselves.
So what's happening now?
Well, about a week ago, I went in to check and see what kind of progress had been made, and unfortunately they had failed to make any queens with the eggs. So I didn't see any queen cells. I saw a few queen cups on the bottom of the frame, but no eggs in them because they didn't have a laying queen. So I decided at that point to ring a local queen breeder and say, have you got a queen? Otherwise, my other option would have been to merge the hive back together, which you can do using a newspaper method in between the 2 boxes. But I want to expand my apiary, so I decided to see if I could find a queen, and here we have our little queen bee and her attendants in a little cage with a sugar plug. And so today basically we're just going to go in and have a look and just double check that it's definitely queenless, and then install the queen.
If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below.
So
you'll be able to watch live as we insert the queen into this hive, if indeed they still are queenless.
Yeah.
If you've got questions about that, put it in the comments below, or any general questions about beekeeping or our flow hive invention.
Cool.
So we're just going to take the lid off. We're undoing the wing screws on the side of the flow hive to roof.
So those little screws, so we don't...
In this case we've actually got one of the earlier inner covers. So this is the one I took onto the TEDx stage. So
yes.
I had it well closed so no bees got out when I was doing my TED talk.
So I just kind of maybe pinched an old box from my brother's backyard to make my split. So this is just an old prototype box that he had lying around that I snaffled. So just a couple of puffs of cool smoke. We actually already gave them a puff before we started, so they've had time to settle, and maybe time for our hoods. I keep forgetting.
If you're new to beekeeping, do make sure you protect yourself as well as you can to minimise stings.
Yeah. So making sure that you do up zips properly, and I want to get stung in the face. I beekeep without gloves, but that's because I'm really comfortable. When I first started, I really always wore gloves. But now I find that I can be more gentle and more in tune with what I'm doing without. But if I do have an aggressive hive, I wear gloves. So, should I just open up and we can start having a look? So basically the bees propolize the top of this, so I'm levering in my hive tool, and I'm sliding my hive tool and levering it open to break the propolis seal.
So that's the inner cover coming off. Now what she's going to do now is take a good look on the inside of that to check to see if the queen is on the inside, because the inner cover is right on top of the brood nest. If we missed a queen last time, then we want to make sure that she's not hiding on the inside of the roof. Unlikely, because we think this hive is queenless.
Yeah, and there's a hive beetle running around there. There are a few hive beetles around at the moment. I'm actually just going to squash that one.
Any questions, put them in the comments below, and we'll get to answering them while we're on this call.
So I'm just popping it there. That's what, if you don't feel confident in spotting your queen, you can place that so if she was on there, or any bees that are on there can crawl back into the entrance. I know new beekeepers do find it challenging sometimes to find their queen. And so if you have a look at this, we can see these are the 4 frames of brood that came from this hive actually. Yeah. So these are the 4 frames of brood that came from this hive. This is an old comb that had the wax cut out, and these 2 are new and empty. And this one actually was from another hive that had a bit of honeycomb cut out. So I just had a little bit of honeycomb left on it, so I popped it in to give them a head start. But they haven't really moved off these 4 frames or drawn any comb, which...
So the easiest thing to do is to take out some of the ones that look easy to get out first. Use the chisel end of the tool, lever it across a little bit, and then use the J end of the tool to lift that up just by inserting it under the end bar and lifting like that. And once we've got a few out, it'll make it easier to move the frames sideways, and then we can start having a really good look at the frames and checking to see indeed if there is any eggs or any sign of a queen. Okay, again chiseling across first. You find if you just go straight for a lift, sometimes you will lift these nails out because they really do propolize down the side here to join the frames together.
Yep. Let's pop that one there. Alright. So, hey bees. So, these are much more propolized than those other ones were as we start to get into the brood nest. And now we're just looking to see whether we have... So this was the honey frame I gave them, so they'd have some resources. Now we do have a queen cup here, but I suspect it would be empty. But can you see that? I'm just going to tip it up, have a good little look. Yeah, it's definitely empty. But that's, you know, they're trying to prep to make a queen, but they don't actually have any eggs left or any resources. So it was under 3 days, isn't it? Larvae under 3 days, or eggs that they need to produce.
Basically, eggs is the safest thing to do, very young larvae. They can then raise a queen from that. But what we're going to do now is just look through all the frames in case there's some eggs being laid, not to be confused by laying workers. Now, that is a bit more advanced, but sometimes the workers can start laying, and they lay unfertilized eggs, which means they can only hatch into drones. So the sign to, if you do find eggs and the eggs are on the side walls of the cells, sometimes multiple eggs, then it could be laying workers rather than a queen in your hive, because their bottoms aren't as long, they can't get to the very bottom of the cell to lay an egg. But at this stage it looks like there's no laying workers and there's no laying queen. I can't see any eggs. You do have to really get it at the right angle to the light to see down those cells and check to see if there's eggs. So we're doing that now. So far they look like they are queenless.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any on this frame either, seeds.
Okay, so one more frame to check.
Look at this frame.
Again, if you've got any questions, put them in the comments below and we'll get to answering them.
We have one question from Sin. Got a flow hive for my daughter for Christmas. Do you have a contact for a novice to start a hive, please?
Okay, it depends a little bit where you are in the world, but the best places to go are to your local bee clubs. Find an experienced beekeeper around if you can to hold your hand as you get started. You can also look on our website you can have a look at all of the Beginning in Beekeeping series. You can see the many different ways to actually start your colony, whether it's a nucleus or a package or catching a swarm even. We've got videos about all of that to help you get started, but a nice thing to do is find a local beekeeper and they can show you how to get started. It can be a bit overwhelming at first. It depends on what type of person you are. Some people just like to jump in and have a go and learn as they go. Others like to go to do a bee course and learn as much as they can, read 10 books before they start. So both ways are legitimate, but if you are needing some help, reach out to some local beekeepers. Most beekeepers are happy to come and help you get started.
One thing I learnt from a beekeeper this year was a suggestion: if you're having trouble looking and finding the eggs because they're quite small, that actually looking for the glistening, milky worker jelly at the bottom of the cell is easier to see than the egg itself. But yeah, I'm not seeing anything. In fact, all the brood that we did give them that was capped has now hatched out. Oh, there's a virgin queen.
Wow, look at that. Mira's got a good eye for queen spotting.
There she is.
Fantastic.
I think she's virgin because she's tiny, 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 and that we're not seeing any eggs yet. You see her? Just there. Just above my finger.
So you notice she's a bit more golden in colour, and this one's actually got a dark tip to her bottom there.
Yeah, and I find that virgins tend to kind of be a bit more erratic and run around a bit more. Once they're mated and ready to lay, their abdomen extends, is much longer, they're much heavier. So that's my assumption, that my guess is that she hasn't managed to mate yet, and that's amazing. So they must have really...
So we won't be showing you how to insert this queen today, but we can talk you through it, because this hive already has a queen, and it's often on that second look that you find her, because it's easy to miss a virgin queen in a hive because she's often quite small when she starts out, and there's not any evidence of her actually laying yet eggs or brood, so hard to spot and hard to find evidence. In this case, Mira's done well to find her. What would happen if we put the new queen in is, because they already have one, there would be a fight and our new queen would end up losing. So instead of inserting this queen into this hive, we'll use her to make another fresh split and start another colony that way.
Well, actually also, I mean, not knowing whether she's actually going to mate successfully. I've heard that if she doesn't mate within the first 6 days, that sometimes she won't successfully mate. So it might be worth, yeah, we can't really hold on to that, can we? Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that if actually that.
If you wanted to hold this queen just in case, one thing you can do is take a few frames out without a queen on it, leave this queen in its cage, block the end, and the nurse bees inside that nuke box will actually keep her alive and feed her through the mesh here. So if you did want to wait, then you could do it that way. Normally, yeah, if they've successfully raised a queen, she will also successfully mate, but you never know.
Yeah.
I've got some questions. One from Danny. How often should you do a hive check as a new beekeeper?
So that really does depend on where you are in the world. So here in Australia, it's far less frequent. You find the commercial beekeepers might only do a full brood inspection a couple of times a year, whereas other places in the world are a lot more demanding, and you might need to get in there a lot more often if you've got things like varroa that need managing. So during the honey season, you might be getting there and checking on varroa far more often. So the best answer to that question is from your local beekeepers. Oh, look at this, they've started to make a beautiful piece of comb Isn't that wonderful? And interestingly enough, that's a mixture of recycled wax and virgin wax. So they've used some wax from in the hive, and that's why it's not white. It's often when they make this beautiful, fresh starting piece of comb, it's brilliant white. But when it's a cream or darker, then they're recycling wax from around the hive.
And you can see that they're festooning here, so they're basically linking like elbow to elbow, forming like a bee scaffold basically, and that's the position that they use to create the wax and to create the structure. We think that, you know, that must be the ideal shape and size to make the perfect honeycomb cell, but you can actually see just under here they've started this tiny little bit of comb.
A friend of ours, Holly's just walked past on the street here and has a question.
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering, can any queen go in any hive?
Oh, that's a good question.
So that's a great question. The answer is yes if there isn't a queen, and no if there already is a queen. So bees generally, not always, but generally just have one queen per hive, and they will often fight to make sure it stays that way. So if you go and insert that into any old hive, chances are she'll just be killed by the bees. But if they're queenless, you can put this little cage in, and what it's designed to do is a slow release. There's a block of candy there made from sugar. The queen's inside the cage. You can see that's the one with the longer abdomen, and she's got attendant bees with her to keep her well fed, and over time this candy will be eaten away and the queen will be released into the hive. By that time the hive should be used to her pheromones and not kill her. Great question.
Thanks.
So maybe we can show people, if we were going to put this queen in this cell, in this hive that we would put it in the middle of the brood nest.
I have a great question, Cito. One from Toby. Can you let them go too long without a queen? And would it be useless to add her in?
The answer is yes. They will eventually get what's called hopelessly queenless. By that time the numbers of bees are getting less and less, and the workers are starting to lay lots of unfertilized eggs all around the hive in all the cells. And what happens then is you get into a situation where the hive starts to become very unlikely to accept a queen. By that stage you're probably better off merging the colony with an existing one. And to do that there's some tips and tricks, but basically you put a sheet of newspaper on top here, you take off the inner cover, sheet of newspaper, you put that one on top, poke some pinholes in the newspaper to make sure there's ventilation going through. The bees will slowly chew all of that newspaper away and kick it out the front of the hive, and by that time the bees have gotten used to each other and they're less likely to fight. So that's probably the thing to do if you find your bees are hopelessly queenless. Great question.
So maybe if we had discovered this hive was actually queenless, and because of the time of year and because I feel like they've struggled a little bit, I do want to hang on to this queen for a bit and see whether she does successfully mate.
Okay, great.
So I think maybe we'll go up to the office and find a hive with a couple of frames and put them in. But if we were going to, maybe we can walk people through what they would do.
Okay, so to insert this queen into this hive, there's a few things you have to be aware of. One is the orientation you insert the queen cage into the hive. You want to make sure if any of the attendants dies, they don't block the passageway out. You can see that's the passageway out there with the candy block. And if
the
you
bees chew through the candy from both ends to get out.
If you have a queen cage like this, then the candy block would be in here. So here's two common types of queen cages. So in this type you would insert it so that that candy block is orientated slightly upwards. Same with this one, you want the candy block slightly upwards. Just make sure it's not down like that. Now, because you also want the attendants to to be able to feed the queen in the case that she's in there for a long time. This is quite a big block of candy. Then you need to make sure the bees in the hive can get to this mesh area. So the best thing to do is to jam it between the two frames like that. Make sure that candy block's slightly upwards or at least sideways, and leave it sticking up a bit so there's a little bit of mesh area here that the nurse bees can feed the queen through if needed. So you'd then move the frame together like that and jam it there in that position.
Yeah,
now,
or you could show them with the plastic.
If it was this one, it'd be here like this. Squash it between the frames so it stays there, and the queen can emerge from here, making sure the pathway out is not blocked by any attendants. So that's how you insert a queen. Put the lid back on, and within a few days she should chew her way out. Some people do get a stick and poke a hole in the block of candy to speed up that process. In this situation you've got a very large block of candy, so I would recommend doing that. A little stick and just twiddle a little hole, not big enough for her to be released, but that will speed up the process of the queen emerging into the hive. Ideally, you want her to come out within a few days of inserting the queen into your colony.
And the idea around giving her a few days to hatch out is that so your colony gets used to the pheromones of that new queen. Sometimes you will find that you have a hive that you requeen and they will still kill the queen. So there's different methods of getting the bees used to. I know when we're doing beekeeping with Michael Bush and he was doing packages, he was direct releasing the queen rather than hanging it because of the temperature not being, being a bit cold at night, and you don't want the bees to cluster up. So that's when you've got a package, when you've got like a swarm of bees, essentially, an artificial swarm. But yeah, I guess it's just relevant to talk about whether, why we put her in the cage for new beekeepers.
Okay, so we might put those frames back together by moving them close together again. That's an important thing to do. You don't want them to make random comb in between the frames. You want to make sure all of the frames are in the box. Meanwhile, there's a few more questions, so keep them coming in and we'll answer them.
Brian would like to know, how important is it to use a queen excluder in a flow hive?
So that's a great question. I've done a lot of experimenting with that, and the answer I've found is it depends on the queen. So for those that don't know what a queen excluder is it's a grid between your brood box where the queen is laying all the eggs and your honey box or honey boxes. So in this case you can see the black line in here, and that's a grid that's 4.3 millimeters in aperture, and the queen can't get through but the workers can. So that keeps your queen from laying in your honey cells. Now if you remove that in your flow hive, the two things may occur. One is nothing and it functions as normal. The other one is the queen may lay in the flow frames itself, and that is queen specific. I've got a hive right outside my door, no queen excluder, hasn't had one for years, and the queen never lays in the flow frames. I've got other hives where she will, and I've also seen the situation where there's been a hive that has had a queen that doesn't lay in the flow frames. I haven't run an excluder for a couple of years. One day I happened to be sitting there watching the entrance as they dragged out the queen. 3-4 weeks later, eggs were being laid in the flow frames. So that tells me that it's very queen specific. So if you are going to experiment with that, then have a look and check that she's not laying in your flow frames. If your queen doesn't lay in the flow frames, then you're good, but you'll need to check time to time because sometimes they will replace the queen and the next queen might decide to start laying in your flow frames. So if you want to experiment, go for it. Let us know how you go.
So I thought I'd just tell you what I'm doing here and then we can have another question. Basically, I'm putting it all back together, making sure they're all tight, but I'm also, these are the 3 brood frames that have brood. We found the queen on this one. This one I know is a honey frame, so I'm actually placing a new frame in between the brood and the honey frame to give them space to draw comb for brood. And because they're already starting to draw on this comb, I'm giving them an extra edge on this side. So it's important to keep the brood together because they, that's how the bees like it, to service the brood all together. But because I know that's a honey frame, I've decided to just put that in preemptively giving them more space to draw comb specifically to raise brood. And then just center these frames. So the space is evenly on the edge, but all the frames are touching together. And then probably come back next week and see how she's going.
I have a question from Jonas. He says, hive beetles, ? Can you explain for a novice?
Okay, that's a fantastic question, because if you have a look at this hive here, and I open the window, my sister Mira has taken a split from this hive. And you can see the bee numbers are low. So she's taken half of the frames out of the bottom box with the bees on it, so the bee numbers are currently low. And when you have a hive where the numbers are low, there may not be enough bees to really police those hive beetles on all of the surfaces inside your hive. So that is an important time to make sure the hive beetles, the small hive beetle, doesn't take over. So what we're going to do is have a look at what my sister's done here. She's thought of this and used the Flow Hive 2 multifunctional tray down here to catch some of those beetles. And let's have a look what's going on in here. Look at that.
Oh yeah.
Look how many beetles there are. So she's put cooking oil in here. The beetles then get chased down through the screen bottom board. You see all of these black dots are dead hive beetles. So that really lowers the numbers of small hive beetle in the hive and much less likely to have a problem from the beetles. This area is quite a bad area for beetles. The humidity, they really thrive in humid areas. So important to manage those beetles, especially if your colony is low on bees.
Bonnie says, hello from Dudley, New South Wales. I bought my Flow Hive to try and save a hive in a dead tree that had to come down, put the comb in a brood box and had bees going in. 2 days later, it was overrun with maggots. The bees have left and I was left with a crawling mess. Do I dispose of the comb or let it run its course?
Definitely dispose of it. What you want to do is keep any comb away from any robber bees, because robber bees can spread pathogens from one hive to another. So if you've got maggoty comb, the best thing to do is put it into a freezer, and that will kill hive beetle larvae, and if it's in there for more than 3 days, it'll kill the eggs as well. Or if you don't have a freezer available, put those combs into a bucket of water, and that will also do the job of drowning those hive beetle larvae. It's a horrible thing to see, but it does happen, and it happens when the colony is weak and when there's not enough bees to really keep the hive beetles under check. Hive beetles came to Australia about 20 years ago. They're from Africa, and they're everywhere in people's composts, all through the ground. So that's a relatively normal thing to deal with in many parts of the world now, and they do need to be managed when the colony is small. Now, a tip, if you're doing a cutout, and I've been through this a few times before, is make sure you just take some of the brood, just a little bit, and lots of bees. Leave all of the honey behind, all of the pollen behind. Reason being is the bees will then be able to manage a smaller area and stop the hive beetles from taking over. So that seems to be the recipe to doing a cutout, is make sure you don't take too much honey with you. Keep it in a bucket to enjoy feasting on at the next party.
Fiona has a question. I am new to beekeeping, was looking at Hive and wasn't sure if there were any eggs. There was a queen cell, but we noticed a day or so later it looked as though they were swarming, but then quickly disappeared. Could this be a mating flight, and if so, would the queen go back into our hive?
Okay, it depends exactly on what was going on at the front of your hive. So if you just saw a lot of activity, sometimes the orientation flights can be confused for swarming. See a lot of activity at the front and quite a lot of buzzing sound, and it can be confused with a hive swarming. And what tends to happen in a hive is there's a whole lot of bees just emerging from their cells, and they tend to do orientation flights in a batch, and they'll wait till a nice sunny day, perhaps the sun's just come out from behind the clouds, and they go, this is the time to take our first flight. And they all go together, and there's a lot of bees just doing a few circles and back into the hive again, taking a few landmarks. And that's them doing their very first flights. So it could have been that. If you witnessed a whole lot of bees on the front of the hive, then they could have been hot. A hot day can cause a lot of bees to move out of the hive to make way for ventilation pathways inside the hive. If you see the bees hanging down from the entrance, like imagine a bee beard off the landing board, and if that stays there for a number of days, then that's a sign that they may be preparing to swarm. So there's a few things to look out for there. If you're seeing eggs, larvae or a queen in your hive, generally you're going to be good. Check it again in another 2 or 3 weeks and see how they're going.
Diana asks, are the flow hive components tempered for cold climate? She's in Wisconsin, USA.
Okay, that's a really common question. The answer is yes. There's a lot of flow hive beekeepers in the colder parts of North America, even in places like Norway and also in Europe. So the time to harvest honey from a hive is when it's the warmer times, so that's similar to harvesting wherever you are in the world. You're generally harvesting in the warmer times. And as far as bees surviving the winter, it's a wooden box that beekeepers have used for years in very cold parts of the world. Michael Bush in Nebraska digs his hives out of the snow in the springtime, and he uses wooden boxes. So let us know how you go. There's different strategies to managing winters. Some people do like to do a blanket wrap around their hive. There's more information on our website about that.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say I've been keeping bees in Berlin, which is a very cold climate in the winter, for the last few years, and what I've learnt from beekeepers there is actually it's not the cold that will kill the bees, but it's the damp. And so making sure the hive is well sealed and their opening is not too wide and they have enough ventilation. The bees are actually really good if they have enough stores of actually keeping themselves warm because they ball together.
It's amazing, isn't it? They disconnect their wing muscles and they vibrate them, and they eat honey is their fuel, and the vibration creates the warmth, and that allows them to survive incredibly cold temperatures if they cluster together. And they're quite an extraordinary species to be able to survive such harsh
and they
conditions.
They rotate out. They take shifts, so they eat the honey and then they go out to the edge of the ball, the cluster for winter, and then do that vibration. And they call them heater bees. And then they get tired and they go in, get some warmth from the other bees, and the next shift starts. It's pretty crazy.
We have a question from Joanne. I live in the Kimberleys where it's very hot, so how will I go about keeping my hive cool?
Okay, that's a great question. The best answer I can give you there is shade. So if you're in a place that gets extreme temperatures, extremely hot, then the best thing you can do is make sure they're shaded, especially in the afternoon and ideally in the summertime. If you could position your hive so that winter sun would reach them, especially in the morning, that would be ideal, and then summer shade. So use whatever trees you've got or other forms of shade in order to keep your hive nice and cool in those really hot sunny days. You could even put them on your veranda and under a roof if you wanted to.
We have a question from Linda. I got my flow hive and bees about a year ago and let their numbers build up in brood box for a year. Then last December put flow super on. However, with bushfires all around us in North Katoomba, there has been very little activity and none at all in the flow frames. Should I take the flow super off again as there is no forage?
Okay, that's a good question. Now, it's a bit of a sad state of affairs here in Australia with so many bushfires. More forest has burnt here than any other fires in the world, which is a very sad thing for habitat, a very sad thing for our bees. We have people going out rescuing native bee colonies from burnt areas because there's no forage. We donated honey yesterday to some people who are looking after animals burnt in the fires. There's young kangaroos, young joeys that they're finding putting honey on their wounds is actually working twice as fast as any other product. So it's certainly really challenging times for bees and other animals. Here recently we've just had quite a bit of rain, which is so lucky for us, but it's not the same for the rest of the country. If you're in a fire area and your bees don't have enough forage, the best thing you can probably do is feed them. We've got videos on how to quickly make yourself a feeder by putting some jars or bags under the roof of the hive. There's dry feeding, there's wet feeding. If you scroll through our Facebook Live feed, we've got videos showing you how to do that. And what you want to do is let them build up some stores so that they can survive the time without the flowers until the flowers start flowering again. As to whether you should take off the colony, if your bee numbers are really low, take off the super, sorry. If the bee numbers are really low, then it could be an idea to take off the honey super, reduce it down to just a single box and wait till your colony builds up again. Not a bad idea. If you open the windows and you see there's lots of bees, you can leave the super on.
A question from Alexander. I saved a colony from being destroyed. I've placed a brood frame for my other hive to hopefully create a new queen. How often should I check my queenless colony?
Okay, so once you insert a frame with eggs into your queenless colony, then it'll be 16 days before they could produce a queen. Then there's going to be a mating flight that has to take place, and that is weather dependent. So it could be a couple more weeks before you get a mated queen laying eggs. So generally it may be 3 or 4 weeks before you can actually tell signs of a laying queen in the hive. So I recommend going in there in 2 to 4 weeks and have a look. The earlier you go in, the harder you're going to have to look. You're going to have to find a virgin queen, perhaps, like my sister Mira found today in this hive. If you go in 4 weeks' time and there is no eggs or larvae, then they are still queenless and you're going to have to try again, or as quick as you can source a queen from a queen breeder.
Question from Kerry. Hi guys, is it okay to paint your flow hive?
Absolutely. An exterior house paint is the longest lasting finish, especially if you've got our other wood types. This Western Red Cedar is one that does handle better by oiling it, but outdoors you're always going to be fighting nature a bit to keep it looking beautiful wood tones like this. It'll need a little bit of a rub and another oil every 6 months or so to keep this beautiful finish. If you don't want to do that, then a good exterior house paint like this will be the longest lasting finish, and you get many years out of a good house paint.
We have a question from Madison. It's a bit of a long one, but I'll try to summarise it. She's thinking about starting bees and inserting a nucleus into her brood box, and she's wondering how she can do this.
Okay, so to insert a nucleus into your brood box, the best thing to do is follow our how-to videos. We've got ones for starting with a nucleus, a package, a swarm or a split. Have a look at those and it'll guide you through the process. Now, I'll just explain it. In fact, right in this location, one of our beginner beekeeping series was filmed of starting this very hive. Funnily enough, and we haven't been back here filming this for a number of years, so that's interesting. So the basics of it is you get in your bee suit, you fire up your smoker, have that handy. Won't need much smoke because it's a very small colony at the time. And you take your frames out of your nuke box, you put them into your brood box, you insert the rest of the frames, make sure all the frames are inserted, put your inner cover on top of that, so at this stage it'll just be a this size colony. Look after it and your colony should grow. A nucleus has a laying queen, a honey stores, pollen stores. It's basically a going hive that's just very small. So that is the easiest way to start for sure. Buy a nucleus off a queen breeder, get in your bee suit, put them in the box, look after it, and they'll grow.
Madison has another 2 questions. How much land do you need to have in order to buy a flow hive, and does land mass determine which flow hive with the certain amount of frames to buy?
Okay, there's lots of people keeping bees in suburbia and even in the city on their rooftops, so it's not so much how much land you have, it's what available forage there is. City beekeepers do very well because people plant all sorts of things in their garden and they get a really long season and a lot of variety of different flowers. Here, this is a very good spot to keep bees because we're in an urban area. There's lots of people planting things, but we also have the nature reserve wrapping all around us here with everything from the paperbarks that flower through the winter to the Banksias that flower through the winter to the blackbutts that are our big eucalypt trees that flower in the summertime, and all sorts of understory things flowering in the spring. So it really does depend where you are, but have a look around and see whether you've got a nice amount of flowers in your area. Generally, most parts of the world have a time when there's flowers and a time when there's not. For a lot of people, the time when there's no flowers is during the winter time, and it's at that time you need to make sure your bees have enough stores, have enough honey stores to survive that time with no flowers.
Robin asks, is it okay for the bees to be coming out of the back above the core flute? There is not a lot of traffic, but if I'm harvesting, I'll move the core flute up to the top slot. Will I do any damage to bees?
Possibly is the answer to that. So you may have one of our very early bottom boards. Sorry about that. We had some imperfections in the mesh at the bottom and bees could go through those imperfections and onto the core flute slider. So you can fix that up by getting your bottom board out and using a tool or a fork to make sure there's no gaps in your mesh bigger than say 3.5 millimeters, and that'll fix that problem. Otherwise you could just decide to leave your core flute in the top position and leave it there, and it becomes more like a solid bottom board.
Catherine says, hi Cedar, when I'm transferring a frame of brood into a queenless hive in the same area, how do I prevent the bees from the original hive following?
That's a great question, and the answer is what you need to do is actually share the returning bees between the 2 hives. Now what I usually do when I take a split is move the existing colony over and give the new weaker colony the lion's share of the returning foragers. That way this hive will be sure to get enough bees. So what my sister would have done here is the first thing she would have done is move the hive over that way. This was the original location for the original hive, and now the new colony is getting most of the returning foragers to make sure it has enough bees to raise a colony from.
Question from Lyndall. My bees are filling gaps in the flow frame cells with propolis. What should I do?
Okay, so that's normal. The bees will get in there and wax and propolize the flow frame parts together. Depending on your bees, what percentage of wax or propolis, wax normally has a percentage of propolis in it, and bees will sometimes use more propolis than wax, especially in certain times of year in very cold places. So it's no problem. It will still break once you get to the warm times of harvesting. If it's very cold, you might find that it does jam the frames together, but it should still open. Let us know how you go. Sometimes it can be confused with older wax. Older wax does have a dark propolis-like colour, and they could just be using old wax from the hive to join the flow frame parts together, cover the cells in wax, complete the cells, and then they'll start filling those cells from there. So it shouldn't really be a problem.
Terry says, thanks for answering my paint question. Very windy in Perth where we are. Is it okay to strap my hive down to the Besser bricks?
Absolutely. If you're prone to a really windy area, especially if you've got a Flow Hive Classic without those wing screws that hold the roof on, it could be a good idea to tie a strap over the hive to make sure it doesn't blow away or the roof doesn't blow off. At the office where we are, we're right on the edge of the hill. When the wind gets to about 80 kilometres an hour, which is a very strong wind up the slope, it comes up the slope, and we found that sometimes the Flowhive Classic roofs would actually blow off, and that's why when we got to the Flowhive 2 we put these little wing screws that just hold that roof on. You can screw them on and that way your roof won't blow up. In terms of the boxes, the bees really properlise them together and they're unlikely to move unless you've just put them there in the first week or so, in which case they could blow over. But once the hive's been there a while, the bees will stick all the hive components together and it's less likely to come apart if you're subject to high winds.
Jenny says, hi, regarding fires in Australia, would you remind people how to safely use a smoker so they don't accidentally start a fire, please?
Thank you, I was going to cover that. So here it's just raining, there's puddles of water on the road. We're in a situation where it's not a high fire danger right now. But a few days of hot, dry wind in the summertime will change that, and it can change within days. So please be careful using your smoker. The DPI put out some information recently to say you need to check whether you are allowed to use your smoker at all. There could be special circumstances where they say no smokers are allowed. Most of the time in the high fire danger time, in the high fire ban time, you are still allowed to use your smoker if you're careful. And what that means is actually lighting and extinguishing your smoker indoors. Do not ever tip the ash out onto the ground in a dry time. You could start a fire. Also a good idea to put your smoker onto say a metal garbage bin lid when you put it down, and to transport your smoker back to the inside area inside a metal garbage bin or can, so it's less likely to have any embers that could fall out onto the ground. Really important to minimise fire risk. It's if a fire catches on, extraordinary damage happens, so please do be careful.
Bill says, I know this doesn't apply to you in Australia, but have you heard that cedar hives reduce mite counts? I feel like my cedar Flowhive 2 has had fewer mites than my pine Flowhive 1.
That's interesting. I haven't actually heard that. If anybody has heard that as well, please put it in the comments below. Cedar does have amazing antibacterial properties. Be interesting if that extends to mites as well.
Wilson says, what's the best method of transporting your Flowhive? Do you use masking tape to cover the opening?
Okay, great question. So what I tend to do is I take off the roof so it looks like this with the inner cover. That way you can get a really good strap, or two straps is better. Make sure they're either the ratchet type straps, or in Australia beekeepers use what are called M-locks, and they're a strap that goes right around your hive. So you'd be in this position and this position. Make sure it's strapped down nice and tight. The next thing you're going to have to do in the evening, early morning, you can block up your hive once all the bees are home. A lot of different ways to do that. I find steel wool is quite a good one. You can simply add a little bit of smoke to the outside of the hive. The bees will eventually go in, and seize the moment to block the entrance with some steel wool. It's nice if what you block the entrance with has some ventilation, especially if you're using a solid bottom board. It is really important to make sure your bees have ventilation. It's a sad thing when you transport a hive and don't give them enough ventilation. You end up with half the bees dying in the hive. So do make sure either you've got a screen bottom board with plenty of ventilation, or there are other vents in your hive. Bees will block them up. I have gotten into a situation many years ago where the lid has 4 vents in it, but the bees had blocked them up. They didn't have enough ventilation, and sadly a bunch of bees died when I moved that hive. So if you have a look here, this is the mesh we put over this inner cover, because this is the hive we took to a TED talk, so it was on stage. We really didn't want any bees to get out. And if you have a look, the bees have used propolis to block up all of this ventilated area. So every time you're moving your hive, if you've got top vents, you may need to unblock them by using a little nail, and make sure they have plenty of ventilation.
We've got a question from Robin. My bees are building out the flow frames, the ones I have harvested, They've removed the caps, so does this mean they're making longer tubes to refill? I believe she's talking about filling in the flow frame cells with more honey.
Okay, yes, so sometimes depending on the honey flow, you'll find that the bees will cap those cells a bit indented even, and you'll see a wavy pattern on the flow frame surface. You can see that here on this side. So if there wasn't much of a flow or the flow ended, you might get into a situation where they even cap it in a bit from the flow frame parts. If you come to the other side of the hive, you can see that they've drawn those cells out further and capped it proud of the flow frame. So it really just depends on how much forage is available at the time, and the bees will then act accordingly. If there's still forage going, they'll draw those cells out further and cap it out further. Thank you very much for tuning in. Tune in again same time next week. Thank you for all your great questions. Do let us know what you'd like us to cover in the comments below, and we'll be sure to cover your questions. The idea is we're here to help you with all of your questions, especially beginner questions, so that you can have success and really enjoy this wonderful world of beekeeping. Thank you very much to my sister here for taking us through her hive.
Thanks for share the love of bees.
And she's become a complete bee enthusiast. Many of the beautiful bee shots, in fact most of them, you see on our Flow Hive websites and Instagram by Mira, and she's got a fantastic eye for that photography and videography.
Bee obsessed.
Totally, bee obsessed.
Awesome.